Finally, a source of raw, real, and honest information on healthcare issues that matter most. Welcome to BS Free MD. From the latest medical information to how to stay sane as a doctor or a patient, no subject is taboo, no BS is allowed. Now, let's welcome your hosts, Doctors May and Tim Hindmarsh.
Welcome back to another episode of BS Free MD, where we dive deep into the intersections of medicine, relationships, and the politics of life. And today we are flying in a familiar direction like that. We have a special guest, Colonel Tom Buzz Rempfer. He's a retired USAF pilot and a distinguished advocate for military health rights. Colonel Rempfer has had a remarkable career flying missions in the F-16, F-117, C-130, and serving as an A-10 forward air controller. He has over 5,500 flight hours and has earned a master's degree through the Naval Postgraduate School's Center for Homeland Defense and Security, where he received the Outstanding Thesis Award. Beyond his military service, Colonel Rempfer has been a pivotal figure in addressing the controversial anthrax vaccine mandate, advocating for the rights of service members. And he is now he's the author of the book Unyielding, which is an amazing title. I love it, which we'll get into, but it's Unyielding: Marathons Against Illegal Mandates. So this episode is dedicated to Lieutenant Colonel Russ Dingell, a valiant fighter pilot and advocate for soldiers' health rights, who passed away in 2005. And Lieutenant Colonel Dingell's legacy continues to inspire efforts for justice and accountability in military health policies. Well, all right. Welcome to the show. Thanks for being here with us. We are honored to have you and excited to get into it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Why don't we start with, I don't know, the fun background, which everybody likes, and tell us a little bit about your journey that led you to become a pilot and enter the Air Force and get to your endpoint as a colonel.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the gracious intro. I was very fortunate. I was able to fly some of the most wonderful platforms for our Air Force. I was able to receive education at the Air Force Academy and at the Naval Postgraduate School. So I was very lucky throughout my military career. And unfortunately, in the middle of my military career, I witnessed many troops being denied that opportunity, that right, that privilege to continue to serve their country because the military kicked them out over the anthrax vaccine mandate, which upon analysis, using all the educational tools that the military had given to me, we determined that it was patently illegal. The mandate was patently illegal. Therefore, all of the discharges of these troops were wrong and should have been reversed. Some have been reversed. Basically, in honor of my colleague, Russ Dingell, who was the leader of our Tiger team back in the 1998 timeframe, I wrote the book, tried to tell his story and my story, and explain to the American people essentially what we went through, beginning in 1998 when we were tasked by our chain of command to review the anthrax vaccine program and determine if there were any problems that needed to be highlighted to the chain of command. And so we did that. We discovered fairly quickly that there was a Senate report that said that the vaccine was investigational as it was used during the first Gulf War. That was problematic because there was a law on the books as a result of the prior experimentation of troops during the first Gulf War that said the military could not mandate investigational or experimental products. And so we knew right off the bat that it was problematic because that report also said that the anthrax vaccine was considered investigational as to how they used it during the first Gulf War. So it appeared that it directly violated the mandate. So We looked into it a little deeper, and we discovered that there was a request for proposal by the military in 1985 to procure a new vaccine, one that would actually work, one that would be efficacious and have less safety problems. But they never did that. Instead, they were mandating the old anthrax vaccine. Simultaneously, in 1985, the government actually published a proposed rule in the Federal Register to try to get the vaccine licensed properly. Now, the interesting thing was that my colleague Russ Dingell researched at the Hartford, Connecticut Government Repository of Documents in the Federal Register and discovered there was no final rule. They proposed to license the vaccine by the Food and Drug Administration, but they never actually did it. So it was, no kidding, an unlicensed drug product by the Food and Drug Administration, and it was also investigational. Then we discovered that the military had actually submitted investigational new drug applications just prior to the mandate to try to get it properly approved, but it wasn't approved. So the mandate appeared to us to be patently illegal. We warned the chain of command about that, and the chain of command literally referred to us as traitors if we were not going to submit to the vaccine. So we didn't. We'd never, in our collective experience, ever had this kind of intimidation, coercion, bullying, harassing by the military in our entire, military experience. So we did not comply. They grounded us from our jobs, and as a result of not being able to fly, they would have removed us from the military. So we sidestepped and transferred to other units where we weren't required to take the vaccine. And we continued to fight against the program. We testified to Congress. We submitted a citizen petition to the Food and Drug Administration. And the Food and Drug Administration admitted that the vaccine had not been licensed by the agency. And so later on, that became a foundational basis of a court case where the judge stopped the program, enjoined the Department of Defense from continuing the mandate, and basically said that, quote unquote, from the judge's ruling, that soldiers cannot be treated as, quote unquote, guinea pigs. There was also a lot of political activity during the 2000-2001 timeframe, where elected representatives were trying to get the Department of Defense to do the right thing, correct records. Senator Daschle was one of our greatest advocates, and he specifically questioned Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld about the punishments meted out, again, quote unquote. And he was attacked with anthrax. So yes. Here you have one of the top lawmakers in the Congress questioning the Secretary of Defense about anthrax vaccine. And just prior to 9/11, the Department of Defense actually conducted a review, which essentially concurred with his concerns. And they said, hey, we need to stop the program, minimize use of the vaccine, develop a new vaccine, which they had said that they needed to do as early as 1985, 15 years earlier, but had not done. And so we believed that the program was actually going to be stopped. Then 9/11 happens, and a week after 9/11, there are anthrax letters that are put in the mail. It was very suspicious to us, based on all of this background. And sure enough, right after the anthrax letters showed up, they abandoned their intention to cancel the program, develop a new vaccine, and they ended up accelerating the vaccination program. And Senator Daschle was actually one of the people that was attacked. And so, it's very, very concerning. It took 10 years, but ultimately the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, and the Department of Justice ended up determining that the motive for the anthrax letter attacks in 2001 was to rejuvenate or resuscitate the failing anthrax vaccine program. So it took 10 years. As a result of it taking so long, nobody went back and resurveyed their judgments. Nobody went back and corrected the records. It took us many, many years after that to try to say, hey, this whole thing was a massive malfunction. The program was only resuscitated temporarily due to the anthrax letter attacks. The anthrax letter attacks were effectively a lab leak out of an Army lab.
Fort Detrick, wasn't it?
Yeah, the anthrax spores came from Fort Detrick. So, in modern parlance, everybody kind of knows about lab leaks because of COVID. And I'm trying to emphasize that, hey, there was a lab leak 20 years ago, and it all related to trying to save a vaccine program. No different than with COVID. It appears there was a lab leak, and that lab leak ended up creating a push to try to mandate investigational or unapproved medical products on the American population and the troops. And so there's a lot of parallels, and there's many more than that. I've got a list of about 20 different parallels and patterns between the two, debacles, and we can go through some of those. But that's the background in a nutshell. And I didn't even mention that prior to the anthrax vaccine mandate, the FDA had issued a notice of intent to revoke the manufacturer of the anthrax vaccine's license. I mean, they basically said the quality control problems at your lab are so significant that we're about to revoke your license, prior to the Department of Defense announcing that they're going to do a mandate. So total breakdown. This kind of stuff should not be happening in military operations. When I'm out there in the past flying F-16s, F-117s, A-10s, that's not the way we do business. When there are serious safety signals, we stop the operation, we ground the operation, we abort the operation. There are no-go criteria. With both anthrax vaccine mandate and COVID injection mandates, there were multiple safety signals and operational reasons to either not go forward with a mandate or to cancel mandates. And unfortunately, with these programs, they tend to be stovepipe from the top down. And as a result, the cogent thought processes and reviews end up not occurring, and they end up mandating these programs without the proper thought processes being completed.
So let me just reiterate a little of this, because there's a lot of information there, and I want to make sure that the listeners get this, because I have gone way down this rabbit hole, so I'm completely tracking with what you're saying. So first off, I'm assuming that the reason that you and Lieutenant Colonel Dingell were, worried about the anthrax vaccine was because it wasn't approved, and it's not like you guys were anti-vaxxers, didn't get vaccinated with all the stuff you were supposed to get in the military, right? So what specifically was it that made you push pause when they started rolling out the anthrax vaccine?
So the chain of command asked us to give inputs. We gave inputs and warned the chain of command that the program was illegal. Chain of command blew us off. On my website, unyielding.org, there's actually a video of the commander implying that we were traitors if we did not go along with the program. So as I mentioned before, we knew that there was a serious problem, and the military had trained us to challenge illegal orders. And we knew this was an illegal order. So therefore, that's why we refused the vaccine, because we knew it was unapproved. And that's why we challenged the chain of command on it, testified to Congress. And we also believed on a more intellectual dimension that the vaccine program represented an amazing doctrinal shift, where suddenly we're going to start inoculating people against this very dynamic form of warfare. And so our congressional testimonies focused on this doctrinal departure. And as it turned out, they were planning on a whole new regime of appropriations and expenditure and vaccines called the Joint Vaccine Acquisition Program, the anthrax vaccine program being the launch program. Fortunately, since it was such a disaster, we did not have other biological warfare vaccine mandates that ever came down, because they bungled this one so badly. And it wasn't until the COVID mandates that they ended up essentially doing it again. Once again, a gargantuan failure, a gargantuan fraud, because they were. Go ahead.
Oh, so I know that me, and a lot of listeners who are maybe haven't really tracked a whole lot with I know about the anthrax vaccine and the military thing, but were you actually, aside from the like you said, the legality and how it was enforced. Were you seeing anything else personally with side effects, problems, people getting sick, or was it more on the whole logistics of the just that there was no choice and they're mandating it and it wasn't approved? Or
yeah, good question. So in our own personal and professional realm, it was a principled decision based on the adverse reaction from the chain of command to our thoughtful inputs about the illegality of the order. So it was simply a principled, dutiful action to refuse the program. But simultaneously throughout the military, there were a great deal of adverse reactions, pockets of severe illnesses. Dover Air Force Base was in the news quite a bit. But this occurred throughout the military, and there are Government Accountability Office reports that validate the significant safety problems and the significant adverse reaction problems that were happening with the vaccine. So in parallel with our professional opinion about the illegality, there were serious problems with respect to safety that ultimately were validated by the Congress and the GAO. And there actually ended up being a House report, the only House report or Senate report on anthrax vaccine, and it was titled Unproven Force Protection, and it's House Report 106-556. And it specifically says that the program was illegal. It talks about how it was not conducted in accordance with the law. So the code there is that it was illegal because they were mandating an investigational product in violation of Title 10, Section 1107 of the U.S. Code. So there were significant safety problems. That wasn't originally our approach. Our approach was to show that there was a process breakdown. They basically were violating all processes, they were violating doctrine, and they were violating the law. But in parallel with that, there were significant safety problems as well.
So here I'm sitting here with my disproportionately large head trying to figure out why in the hell they would want to mandate this. And I can only come up with two reasons. I had a medical student who left the Air Force because of the anthrax vaccine. And he said that there was some connection between whoever owned the company being a gigantic, Clinton donor, part of the donor class. So there's the standard, follow the money. I tried to follow the science and all I did was followed the money. Okay, there's that. But there's something here that I think is far more probable or as probable and much more sinister, which is why would you be freaking out, breaking the law to mandatorily vaccinate everybody for something that's never been used in warfare? Well, the reason was exactly why they sent anthrax to Tom Daschle, because we had it and we were going to use it in country. We were going to experiment with this on the Iraqis. That to me is common sense. So we had to vaccinate all of our guys so we could go in and say, oh, there's weapons of mass destruction. There's weapons of mass destruction. And then they accidentally blew up a weapon of mass destruction, which was ours. And then you have a cover story and you actually use it in warfare to see how it worked. Because these guys always want to see how stuff actually works in warfare. That's what the conspiracy side of my brain says. Otherwise, why would you be so excited about mandating it? It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. So to your first point about the other interests, there was a former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and former chief of naval operations and former ambassador to England who had a major financial stake in the company prior to and during the process of trying to get the Department of Defense contracts. So there are what I would say are some significant financial conflicts of interest. And so I think that there is validity to your first point. I don't go to your second point. Ultimately, the UN weapons inspectors determined that there were no weapons of mass destruction at the time that they were accusing Iraq of having weapons of mass destruction. I believe that, it was more of just a negligent attempt to start a new realm of government appropriations with service members being the captive guinea pigs. We were in a post-Cold War timeframe where there were people that had the bright idea that they thought that this new biodefense realm would give massive appropriations to the Department of Defense and to the government to kind of replace the Cold War threat. So to me, it's as simple as that. To me, I think that they were essentially creating threats. I don't think that they were had any intention of creating a threat overseas and actually utilizing or implementing biological weapons against an enemy, because that is barred by international treaty and our own rules. I do not believe that they were going to do that, and I think that most of the malfunctions here can be attributed to straight up, as you mentioned, arrogance by people that were trying to force a program and get massive new appropriations. And the reason why they mandated it was they had to have an audience. Had they not mandated it, they wouldn't have been giving any anthrax vaccine to any troops. They ultimately had the intention of giving it or offering it to civilians as well. And a matter of fact, they ended up procuring billions and billions of dollars of this anthrax vaccine for the Strategic National Stockpile to be potentially used for civilians. That was one of the reasons why, when I was at the Naval Postgraduate School, I actually wrote my thesis about it, because over the years we had documented such a completely incompetent and negligent program and experience with the anthrax vaccine in the military. I felt like it was important for the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Health and Human Services to understand those data points. And I did win the thesis award for the work. So that's at the Naval Postgraduate School, and the thesis is still on the Department of Defense websites, dtic.mil. And so I think it's strictly incompetence and negligence. I don't think there were any nefarious objectives to use anthrax on an enemy. That would have been morally, ethically, legally imprudent to do. So,
yeah, and that makes sense. Voice of reason. I love it. So again, it's just back. It's back to money. It's an expansion of the military-industrial complex, because now the military-industrial complex is, as Bobby Kennedy would say, the biological or pharma-industrial complex are all part of the same thing. Like, all of this stuff grows out of the Department of Defense. We interviewed Sasha Latipova a couple of years ago. That was one of her things where you look back at how where a lot of the money came from, funneled through the NIH. It all had DoD fingerprints on it for the development of the COVID vaccine, for the gain of function research. Really pretty amazing stuff when you think of it. Like, where this bio defense, we already had nuclear weapons. We already were, almost 100 years ahead in conventional weapons by 1990 of every other country in the world. So where do you go next? You go to the cheap stuff, which is biodefense. And that became, because almost anybody with a lab can make biological weapons. So we need to make biological countermeasures. And what could possibly go wrong?
Yeah, and instead what they're doing is, part of our congressional testimony and our original doctrinal analysis was, why are we going there? When I was at the Air Force Academy, they gave us this book called War Morality in the Military Profession, and it talked about the chemical and biological warfare taboo. And basically the outtake from that was, we don't go there, right? These threats have been around for decades and decades. We don't go there because once you do, there is massive proliferation, tit for tat. As far as we develop a threat, they develop a countermeasure, back and forth, gets worse and worse, and you have an amazing escalation. And that's why the military adhered to a chemical and biological warfare taboo. We are not going there, right? And that also was consistent with chemical and biological weapons treaties. We weren't supposed to go there. And unfortunately, they've taken this exemption for doing defensive research. And there's such a blurred line, a fine line between offensive and defensive research, that they've used that in order to get their appropriations, to defy the CB taboo, the chemical and biological warfare taboo. And it's ended up being used in an offensive manner. Okay, so the case in point is the anthrax letter attacks, right? Out of Fort Detrick, it was supposedly only defensive research, but ultimately there were weaponized spores that were produced and were employed against the American people, against Senator Daschle, one of the few elected representatives that was questioning the anthrax vaccine program. And ultimately the motive was to resuscitate that failing program. So there's a fine line. Defensive research becomes offensive, and that's why much more strict controls have to be implemented, adherence to international treaties, and as I say, take away their petri dishes, because right now they've proven themselves incapable over and over again of being responsible with this kind of defensive research.
So let's fast forward to 3-4 years ago, when you saw what was going on with the COVID vaccines and, the military mandates and all of this kind of stuff. Was this just like deja vu all over again? Like what was your kind of emotional response to this? Because, it's like this was, the anthrax was basically military. COVID was everything, right? I mean, it was, you lose your job. You can't you can't fly on an airplane. You have to be tested every 3 days if you're not vaccinated and you're in Hawaii. I mean, like it was a complete shit show. So when you started seeing this, was it like immediate flashback? It's like, okay, I know what's going on now because I've lived this once before, or what was your response?
Yeah, so my response was there appeared to be a lot of similar patterns. And as a result, I worked with RFK Jr. at Children's Health Defense and his team, specifically invited in by Dr. Merrill Nass, who had worked with us years earlier on the anthrax vaccine issue. And we developed a citizen petition, just like that citizen petition that we successfully filed and received a response over anthrax vaccine back in the 2001-2002 timeframe. We developed a citizen petition to try to challenge the potential of future COVID mandates. At the time, I can be idealistic and naive. At the time, I figured there's no way they're going to mandate these products because they are emergency use. They've learned these lessons. Clearly, they've learned these lessons from the anthrax vaccine experience. But unfortunately, shortly after we filed the citizen petition, they basically denied it and they announced mandates. And so we found it really fascinating, disturbing that they announced the mandates, but then essentially simultaneously announced that they were going to continue to use the emergency use authorized product, and they actually reissued the emergency use authorization, and there was no FDA approved product available. So the law still applied, and the law said that both soldiers and citizens all had to be given their option to accept or refuse. And unfortunately, the government did the hocus pocus with the paper only FDA approval in order to try to make it look like the vaccine product that was out there in the US marketplace was approved, but it wasn't. It was all emergency use authorized, and therefore all of the mandates were illegal. And I don't know if you guys had an opportunity to receive and potentially call up that Secretary of Defense directive and screen share it, but if you do, I'll point out paragraph 5, where it specifically says troops will only be mandated FDA approved product, right? And so the reality is that throughout the duration of the mandates, while all the troops were being kicked out, coerced out of the military, over 10,000 of them, throughout that entire time frame, what they were doing was in express violation of the Secretary of Defense directive that said they will only be mandated FDA-approved product. That FDA-approved product did not exist. They blatantly violated that Secretary of Defense directive. And if you're not able to screen share it, it's on my website, unyielding.org. On the COVID tab to the right-hand side. The Secretary of Defense directive is still online with the Department of Defense. They broke their own mandate, and every trooper that they pushed out of the military should be given their jobs back or have the opportunity to come back into the service. And any discharges that they did to these troops that were less than fully honorable need to be fully expunged, reversed, and it needs to happen based on some kind of presidential proclamation or executive order, because At this point, it doesn't appear that the military has the moral courage or ethical fortitude to do this on their own. So I think it's going to have to be either legislated by Congress or ordered by the President of the United States through an executive order. That should happen. I think it will happen in time. Most of the time, whether it has to do with, radiation testing or Agent Orange or Gulf War illness, many decades later, they apologize to the troops. My point has been from the very beginning that they should be, first of all, not implementing these illegal programs and creating these injustices and inequities and fomenting these errors, but they should actually apologize and correct things real time or shortly thereafter. That didn't happen with anthrax vaccine. It has happened in a few cases where soldiers had been able to ask for the records to be corrected. But they need to do it on a wholesale basis for all troops and not make service members apply individually.
This is staggering. We unfortunately, I don't know if I'm going to be able to screen share it, but I'm reading this.
StreamYard, we can't.
I'm reading this, and it's like mandatory vaccination against COVID-19 will use COVID-19 vaccines and receive full licensure from the Food and Drug Administration in accordance with FDA-approved labeling and guidance. Service members voluntarily immunized with the COVID-19 vaccine under FDA emergency use or World Health Organization emergency use listing in accordance with blah, blah, blah. So if you volunteered, you could get the EUA drug. Otherwise, It had to be the mandatory vaccination was only allowed that from full licensure. And then you read the next paragraph, and it said mandatory vaccine requirements will be implemented consistent with DoD instructions 6205.02, July 23rd, 2019, which is that you have to use a approved product,
right?
Which they didn't use.
That Secretary of Defense memo says only FDA approved product. That did not exist, and it even provides that context that EUA product is voluntary, strictly voluntary.
Yes, yeah,
and so this was an important output from our federal case, which found the anthrax vaccine program illegal. They created this emergency use authorization law just after the injunctions and just after the court found that the Department of Defense and the Food and Drug Administration were, quote, not substantially justified, right? They paid our attorneys. The government paid our attorneys. And the government doesn't pay the plaintiff's attorneys unless the plaintiff's attorneys, the soldiers' attorneys won, right? So they paid our attorneys, and then they created a new law that basically said these emergency use authorized drugs, which are, this is really important, they're unapproved, right? These are unapproved drug products. And so emergency use authorized drugs, and this is on the FDA website, if you just Google search, FDA and emergency use authorization, they are unapproved drug products. And so when they used unapproved drug products, they had to do it on a voluntary basis. That's consistent with the subset of the law, Title 10, Section 1107A, which specifically says soldiers have to be given their prior consent rights. And when they applied this very first ever emergency use authorization to anthrax vaccine, they actually published in the Federal Register that it would be strictly voluntary, that there would be no penalty, there would be no punishment, no loss of benefits, no loss of entitlements. There could be no punishment whatsoever for refusing an emergency use authorization law. They put it in the Federal Register. That is also on the COVID tab of unyielding.org, that Federal Register entry. So the precedent was there, the law was there, and the Department of Defense and the U.S. government blatantly broke that law. The mandates were patently illegal. And that's why the Department of Defense needs to do the right thing and go and correct the records.
So you are an advocate for this, obviously, and you wrote a book and have worked with Bobby Kennedy and all of these amazing things. So what if you're a service member listening to this show and it's like, well, they screwed me over illegally. What do I do? Who do they contact? How do you how does it work? What's the kind of pragmatic nuts and bolts of this?
Yeah, the practical reality is the mandate has been stopped. Similar but different to the stopping of the anthrax vaccine program back in the 2003 to 2000 time frame that was stopped by the courts. In 2023, the Congress, the legislature, stopped the COVID mandate. So they don't have to worry about the mandate at this point. As far as people that were illegally ordered to take the vaccine, that's a significant problem. They should write their elected representatives and lay out the facts that the Department of Defense memo specifically said they would only be mandated emergency use, only be mandated fully approved product, but they were mandated to take emergency use authorized product. And so many in Congress are, I think, illegality shy. They don't want to talk about the illegality of the program, probably because they know perfectly well it was patently illegal. That's probably why the Congress stopped the mandate. But it might encourage them, the Congress members, to actually legislate across the board correction of military records, because the Department of Defense so egregiously violated our service members' health rights and bullied them and coerced them, harassed them into taking something that was supposed to be optional.
So do you have friends on the inside? Like, are there Air Force generals that are like, yeah, okay, I get this. You know, because I understand, you know, you get to a certain level of rank, and you know, it's a political office for, you know, the most part. Is everyone fighting this? Guys that were military that are retired that understand the system that are fighting from the outside. Is there anybody on the inside that's like, come on, guys, this is ridiculous?
Yeah, during the Bush administration, people were contacting us. H. Ross Perot contacted me personally, sent me to a variety of meetings in Washington, D.C. As a result of those meetings, we were invited to meetings inside the Pentagon to work with the Bush administration on trying to fix these major malfunctions. Karl Rove, the advisor to the president, called me, asked me for all of my information, made sure that I was aware that his Deputy Secretary of Defense, Paul Wolfowitz, was organizing a review of the program. Their undersecretaries, Dr. David Chu and Pete Aldridge, made the recommendations to the Secretary of Defense to stop the anthrax vaccine program. So historically, there were people on the inside that were asking for our help, and we have always provided that help. During COVID, nobody on the inside has asked for our assistance. Unfortunately, the program was very stovepiped and siloed. They basically did not implement the previous president's strategic national biodefense strategy, which was intended to bring all the stakeholders together before any kinds of mandates or emergency use authorized products were employed. Had the strategic plan, the biodefense strategy, been implemented, they probably would have honestly determined that, hey, this was actually a lab leak as a result of irresponsible biodefense enterprise, illegal, gain of function research at the Wuhan lab in collaboration with the Chinese, shared responsibility. And I think that they would have thought twice before they immediately moved to implement the countermeasures that the same people who collaborated in the in causing the lab leak. I think that they would have been very cautious about taking their recommendations and suddenly implementing countermeasures. That biodefense strategy was put in place by the previous administration based on the disaster of the anthrax vaccine program. It's actually mentioned in presidential memos that was one of the bases. So had the biodefense strategy been implemented and had the lab leak been properly categorized as a bioincident, they probably would have been looking at a cogent process for putting forth countermeasures in the future. They probably would have looked at the anthrax vaccine experience and realized that, hey, these countermeasures have to be strictly voluntary, just like they were for the military. But they didn't do any of that. Instead, it was stovepipe. They let Mr. Fauci and others control the operation and force upon the American people ill-advised, illegal mandates for emergency use authorized products. So a major breakdown. You ask me if I know anybody on the inside today. One of my dear old friends from my military experience that I flew F-16s with is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He's the top guy in the United States military. I have tried to engage top military leaders about these issues, and they are 100% NORDO. NORDO stands for no radio, pilot term for communications blackout. They are not reaching out. Even though I have 25 years of experience dealing with these kinds of malfunctions in the military, at this point, they have absolutely don't appear to have any interest in reaching out and fixing this for our troops. I'm hopeful that will change down the road. It needs to. If it doesn't happen within this administration, it needs to happen with the next administration.
Yeah, I mean, it's just amazing because when you see what's happened in the last week with the revelations from these emails from Fauci's chief advisor and how to cheat FOIA so that you can hide what you were doing, and how they were completely hiding anything to do with the lab leak, and it's all coming out. It's all bubbling to the surface. My guess is they're going to give this guy, what is his name, Morton or something like that. They're going to give him a pass and get him to squeal on Fauci and Collins and the guys higher up. That if it was a real prosecution, that's what's going to happen. Well, if that happens, and you're the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, your head's on the chopping block too for not squealing about the military mandates when we're injecting 18 to 40-year-old young people who have virtually zero risk from COVID with clearly a vaccine that its highest risk for side effects is in that age demographic. And so my thing is I want to end the day and end my life hopefully in the distant future knowing that I was on the right side of history, even though I made mistakes and had to change my mind. I changed my mind so that at the end of the day I'm on the right side of history. And I think there's a lot of people here lined up on the wrong side of history.
Yeah, and I think they're realizing that there's a slow leak of the truth coming out. All you have to do is look at that Secretary of Defense memo and read paragraph 5 and realize that they actually willfully implemented a program that was in direct violation of their own directives, right? There is no excuse for what they did. They need to fix it wholesale for all the troops. And when you look at stuff like the revelations about the intention to cover it up by either Mr. Fauci or the other entities like Mr. Moran's, it speaks to this incompetence and negligence that was going on. I've heard some good analysis recently where people have put out the possibility of, we've been arguing about, is this a natural occurrence or a synthetic occurrence, a non-natural occurrence? Was it a lab leak, right? If they really did not believe that it was a lab leak, why did they try so hard to cover up everything they were doing related to origins? Why did Moran's have his emails deleted? Why did he create a private account? It's not a good look. It absolutely points to the fact that they knew that what they were doing was wrong or was highly suspect. And that's why they created the proximal origins paper. And that's why they got some of the scientists after or shortly thereafter giving them massive grants to create a scientific paper in order to try to gaslight anybody who would talk about lab leak and refer to them as conspiracy theorists. So that's another pattern that we had with the anthrax vaccine. If you actually look at the scientific papers prior to the Gulf War timeframe where they started to use anthrax vaccine, the scientific papers about anthrax vaccine were highly critical. Everybody agreed that they needed a new vaccine. That's why there was the request for proposal in 1985. That's why they tried to get the vaccine properly licensed, but never did so in 1985. They knew it was problematic. But then what they do is, after the use of the anthrax vaccine in the first Gulf War and for the anthrax vaccine mandate, military scientists start putting out papers saying the anthrax vaccine is the greatest thing since sliced bread. And the bottom line is, it wasn't. They knew it wasn't. All the scientific literature prior, there's a whole chapter in my master's thesis about this, about how they actually actively attempt to change the scientific and literary record to support their preferred narrative about anthrax vaccine being safe and effective. It wasn't. They knew it wasn't. All the scientific documentation prior showed that it wasn't. And so they did the same thing with COVID. They tried to create scientific literature to say that the origin was natural. They tried to create scientific literature to say that the COVID vaccines are safe, effective, and FDA approved, when in reality, the actual weight of the scientific literature shows the opposite, that there are serious safety signals. Everybody in America and the world knows that from an efficaciousness standpoint, they are a total failure. They did not stop infection and they did not stop transmission. So the injections literally don't meet the definition of a vaccine. That's why they changed the definition of a vaccine.
Yeah.
And they were totally illegal. And so as a result, these incompetent and negligent military and government officials, they need to be stopped. You need to take away their petri dishes. You need to create some kind of 9/11 style commission to analyze what these folks have done. I've been doing it for 25 years, and I would not, to this day, consistently over the course of 2+ decades, I would not be saying the exact same thing, that these leaders that we are supposed to be serving the public and protecting the public have blatantly violated the law. I've been saying the same thing for 25 years, and now it absolutely directly, similarly applies to COVID and COVID mandates.
Well, when we had on our show, Lieutenant Colonel, right, Pete Chambers, he shared exactly what you're saying as far as the cover up, the manipulating the data. I mean, as physician, he went in and reviewed it himself, and the numbers were changed right in front of him. I mean, he had them on the screen and saved it, and then he went and met with them and said, "Hey, here's the data." Well, somehow magically it got changed, and this is not like you said, they do this all the time to meet their agenda. And with him, he, faced a lot of retaliation. I know our listeners, I think people are thinking, so you've been fighting this fight for, like you said, 25 years and speaking up against the anthrax situation and just the principle of it. So is there any point along the way in your military career where you did face pushback or what would be the
retribution?
There you go, retribution. Any kind of action because they're like, "Hey, shut up, quit looking into this so much. Just do your job as a pilot and get on with it."
To a certain extent, I think it's fascinating. Again, one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about following through on Lieutenant Colonel Russ Dingell's and my work from the very beginning, and why I'm giving the profits from the book completely to his family and honoring his work. He was the intellectual heavyweight in determining that the program was illegal. So we determined that the program was illegal. So by and large, they were hands off of us while they were simultaneously punishing all these other troops. That infuriated us. To this day, it infuriates me that our military leaders would be so hypocritical that when caught implementing illegal orders, that they would punish these kids. but not punish us. They didn't want to punish us because we had identified the core malfunctions. And so instead, they tried to coerce these other young people in the military and gave them bad conduct, dishonorable discharges. They even imprisoned some of these kids. We've always, ever since, tried to get that fixed. In trying to continue my military career, I was later reprised against. I was actually a victim of reprisal. The chain of command tried to get rid of me out of one of my military units, and I was able to successfully find safe harbor in another military unit. But the military actually said that the Department of Defense leaders that had retaliated and reprised against me were guilty of substantiated reprisal, which is a violation of Title 10, Section 1034 of the U.S. law. And so when I had originally complained about some aspects of the mistreatment of my troops and myself in various personnel processes, the chain of command actually wrote me a memo, and one of the generals said that my unyielding demands of the chain of command that they follow military regulations according to my interpretation will no longer be tolerated. So that gives context to the title of the book. Yeah, that's the context for the title of the book is, rather than the chain of command having a dialogue with me about the injustices that I felt like myself or my other subordinates were suffering with improper processes, hiring practices, and other things, medical processes. Instead of having a dialogue with me about that, instead they say that I'm being unyielding and I have to be fired. And that's what they did. They fired me. But ultimately, the Department of Defense and the Air Force at the highest levels agreed with me and agreed that the chain of command had actually cheated in a bunch of different personnel processes. And that gives context to the theme of the book. You have to be unyielding. Had I just gone away, I never would have gotten things in my own personal situation fixed. I never would have highlighted this unethical behavior by the chain of command and had the Department of Defense at the highest levels agree with me. So being unyielding is essential. The chain of command probably should have had a dialogue with me about my interpretations of law and regulation and as to why I was being unyielding in the first place. That should have happened with anthrax vaccine. It should have happened with some of my subsequent military experiences where those malfunctions led to military leaders being found guilty of reprisal. And it should have had with COVID vaccine. But guess what? It still could happen with COVID vaccine. At any point, the military leadership could exercise the courage and humility to correct things because they patently violated the law and our soldiers' health rights. They could fix this tomorrow if they want to. If they want to call me in because I am fairly unyielding and I know what I'm talking about, I will explain it to them. I will lay it out for them, but they don't need that. It's all on my website. They know what they've done. They blatantly violated these young people's health rights. Those health rights were only put forth in the law, 10 U.S.C. 1107. Those health rights were only established by Congress to protect our troops based on the despicable track record that the Department of Defense has with violating our soldiers' health rights. So Congress needs to enforce the law. The military needs to execute the law. And because it is blatantly obvious that the military violated the law, they need to go back and do the right thing writ large for all of our troops, retroactively, proactively, for all of the troops.
I'm just going to say, what does it take? Because we've had so many conversations too with people in the medical side of things, talking about, retribution as well as making it right, coming out and admitting they were wrong, having justice. And I guess the question I ask, and people are thinking, is that we agree, but what's it going to take, or who is it going to be the one that steps out and does that?
Somebody has to go to jail. Like the thing is, if Fauci broke the law, which I think he did, right, then he needs to go to jail. If If, Francis Collins broke the law, it doesn't matter that he's the head of the NIH, he needs to go to jail. Like, these guys need to have downside, because everything everything they have is upside. They get a piece of the pie if the NIH produces a product that industry, patents, they have patent rights. They get paid. Nobody knows how much money Fauci made off of the COVID vaccines. Nobody. It's undisclosed. So, that alone tells you a gigantic story. So these guys have to go to
right. But is there another? Is that the only way?
It's the only way it's going to change. They have to be scared. They have to be so terrified that if they make a big enough mistake, they go to jail. Because I agree with you. I don't think that this was sinister. I don't think that there's a mentally deficient Bond villain that's pulling the strings doing this. I think it's incompetence and arrogance. Two of the worst things that you can combine. It is like gasoline and fire for bad things to happen. I mean, this is how World War I started. People forget that. It was incredibly arrogant little kingdoms that got in bickering wars and burned the entire world down. This is exactly the same thing. It's arrogance and incompetence. And they need to understand that arrogant incompetence that leads to illegality leads to jail. And I don't know. I have no faith it's going to happen, but I think it's the only way anything changes.
So many people are so in thick in the higher ranks in government and the military, the DOD, that everybody's got a little piece in the pie and no one is ready to sacrifice it to tell the truth. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah. So, I'm a process guy. And so when it comes to accountability, if there is going to be accountability, it's the courts and it's the executive authorities that need to extract that accountability. As a citizen, former service member, retired person, my, effort for accountability is regardless of whether or not you want to hold yourself accountable for your crimes and your violations of Secretary of Defense directives. You need to do the right thing for these troops and fix their records. So that's my level of accountability, which they can do tomorrow. There doesn't have to be a court case. There doesn't have to be a presidential proclamation. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff or the Secretary of Defense could order this tomorrow to have everybody's records corrected and order these corrections boards, which unfortunately with our anthrax cases have taken up to 15 years to get people's records fully corrected, right? So these processes are totally unacceptable as far as how they currently have things designed to fix soldiers' records when it is the Department of Defense that blatantly violated law and directive. So just from a process perspective, there are people in our government that have to extract the accountability you ask for. I think that there are psychological factors involved here where literally everybody to a certain extent has some culpability. The media looked the other way and unfortunately bit off on the lies, half-truths, and false narratives. The Congress, unfortunately, looked the other way and did not enforce the laws that they put on the book. The military chain of command, up and down the chain of command, was derelict in their duty to properly implement the Secretary of Defense directive. And instead, they did these circuitous measures where they pushed people out, coerced people out. They literally only punished one soldier via a judicial process, a court-martial, Lieutenant Mark Bashaw, and they tried very carefully to make sure that it didn't involve his refusal of COVID injections. And so they did that. They intentionally avoided the judicial processes, and instead the entire operation was based on coercion. The military should be absolutely embarrassed and ashamed for executing a Secretary of Defense directive improperly because they did not have FDA-approved product, but they did it through coercion rather than through the normal Uniform Code of Military Justice and manual court-martial processes. They didn't exercise the normal judicial processes because what they were doing, they knew perfectly well, was beyond the law and outside of the Secretary of Defense directive. So they need to look themselves in the mirror. They need to resurvey their judgments. They need to go back and fix these kids' records proactively, retroactively, fully, because what they did was wrong. They need to have those debriefs. I talk about this extensively in the book. You need to handle the operation like any good military operation is handled. You need to have a debrief. You need to honestly assess what you did. And there's absolutely no way that they can make any determination other than the fact that they are 110% wrong. The soldiers that wanted to have their prior consent rights respected are 110% correct. And there is only one solution, and it has to probably be either the Congress or our chief executive, our president, ordering them to fix it. I would maintain that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has that power, influence, and authority to make that happen. The Secretary of Defense absolutely has that power and authority, but if they don't do it, the president or the next president of the United States needs to do it.
So what is your thought? Because, we shared from our family side that we have our family member in the military, fresh. But for people that are young, that are in there, or those that are thinking about a military career, I mean, do you have any thoughts as far as like having hope, being able to still navigate the system? I guess it affects everything now. I mean, with COVID, it wasn't just military; it was mandates on everybody at workplaces. So, do you advise kids like rethink what you're doing if you're going into the military because of choice being put, or lack of choice? Do you have any thoughts for the hope of the military and their young people going in and they're, just keeping their health and choice in mind?
Yeah, so I'm going to start with the question. What kind of a military would you want your children to join? What are some of those qualities?
Yeah, I mean, honesty, right? What's the USAF code of conduct or whatever, right? I won't lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those that do, or something to that extent. I mean, I think that's a really good place to start. Discipline, respect for authority, leadership. I mean, what's the main reason kids go into the military? They want to learn how to be leaders. We want to produce. What do we want as a society? We want obviously a good defense, right, but we want to have leaders that leave the military and go into the civilian world as people that can lead companies and lead their families and lead their communities.
Well, I'm thinking protection. And so for the military is all about protection of the citizens. Don't you think they should be leading by example in protecting their own first? I mean, right down to the veterans. I mean, we see it in healthcare. It just pisses me off. But to the kids, the middle, everybody in the military, it's like protecting them as well as the citizens of the rest of the citizens of the U.S. That just breaks my heart.
Yeah. And of all professions, this is so important for the military to actually live up to the honor code, which you guys basically referred to. The core values of integrity, service, and excellence, the code of conduct, which actually says you're not supposed to stab your fellows in the back. Yes, the oath of office, which is all about the Constitution, which is all about making sure that you're doing things legally and in accordance with the law, right? So our military leaders, our institution has put all of these various standards, in place in order to bar against these kinds of malfunctions. And so for some reason, when it comes to these vaccination mandates, these illegal mandates for countermeasures, they've totally forgotten their core values, oaths of office, codes of conducts, and they need to get back to that. That's the starting point for analyzing all of this. And so, all three of my children joined the military. So not only do I have 25 years of experience in dealing with these kinds of issues and trying to keep the military honest, I actually gave three of my children to the military because despite everything, I still trust that in most operational realms, I would say all operational realms, our military does an outstanding job of living up to those codes ethics, values, and oaths. But when it comes to these types of operations related to these biodefense initiatives and countermeasures that clearly violate the law, for some reason there is a total breakdown. I can't explain it. I'd love to put my finger on it, but the military leadership needs to get to the bottom of it. They need to do the debrief. And until they do that, they're not going to be able to fix these kinds of malfunctions. They've done it twice now. Exact same malfunctions fundamentally with respect to the illegal anthrax vaccine mandate that ultimately resulted in a bioincident, a lab leak in order to try to resuscitate that failing program. And then they did the exact same thing with COVID, illegally mandating emergency use authorized product when both precedent and law said that they could not do so. And they even put it in their Secretary of Defense memo that they could not do so. Only FDA approved product, and specifically mentioning the voluntary, nature of the EUA product. It's right in their memo. So, I think the most important thing, to try to address your question about the kids, is we need the military to be an honest place for our young people to be able to join. So I don't call for people not joining. I call for our military leaders to make sure that the institution is a safe place for them to serve. Unfortunately, they blatantly failed with that, with both anthrax vaccine and COVID vaccine. I think the American people, I think our troops, I think our lawmakers, I think the media would actually be proud of our military leaders if they were able to do the debrief publicly and say that there were significant malfunctions that occurred here. We should have done things differently, and we're going to make it right for our troops.
Well, I can only imagine that your kids, having been raised by you, are very intelligent and have high moral values and hold those codes deep in their heart as well. And I know it gets me teary. Our son is the same way. And so sometimes when he's just getting discouraged, I just say it's people like you, like our kids, that are the next generation that we can have hope in, that they do, stand up like you have done in a similar fashion and try to impart those changes so that it can become a better place for our military members. And that's my positive spin and hope.
No. When I met my son's friends and colleagues, I had a gigantic infusion of hope that the next generation is not completely insane with purple hair cutting their genitals off. So that was super helpful. So I think there is hope. I mean, I think there's always these generational gaps, and then we're like, okay, these people are never going to be okay. And I think they will. I think that we do have hope. We do have some tremendous young men and women that really believe in the bigger principles that guide both the United States and its military. And that's what I'm hoping and praying for, because there's nothing. That's all I got.
Yeah, and that's why I wrote the book, because we have two different lab leaks across 25 years that resulted in illegal mandates. They've basically failed in the operation twice. And although I do believe there are great people in the military, and I do believe that they will have the courage to ultimately fix this, we need to make sure that the military is a safe place for our young people, our children's children. I have a granddaughter now, maybe that young lady will end up serving in the military. So this job is never done. We have to keep the military a safe place for them to serve in, because our nation will always have a military and needs to have a military that's living up to it, oaths and codes and values. So I'm optimistic. I would have been doing this for 25 years if I didn't think that there was hope. Unyielding, kind of shows my path, my experience, my lesson learned. I try to lay out the patterns between these two disastrous episodes and make suggestions on how to fix it. But anyway, unfortunately, they're a very powerful social group and situational, ethic type forces. People know I have my foreword of the book was done by Dr. Philip Zimbardo, famous from the Stanford Prison Experiment. And he writes about these situational ethics situations. He was actually one of my instructors at the Naval Postgraduate School. And what's so important about his work is he documents that these social forces, these group dynamic forces, these situational ethic forces where people, based on the situation, will do wrong things. They will buckle under pressure from leaders. So we know these negative psychological bad behavior type forces exist. We need to be aware of them. We need to stop them in advance. We need to turn these malfunctions, and the military leadership needs to make sure that they're not manipulated by illegal programs and illegal initiatives, and instead they need to stay out in front of this next time. If they don't do it, if this military generation of leaders doesn't do it, if current political leaders don't do it, then our kids' generations will have to do it, because they are going to read about this for decades and decades to come. And it's going to be analyzed. And as we've already seen in the past, 3 to 4 years, so much has come out showing the incredible breakdowns that have occurred, documenting the lack of safety, the lack of efficacy, the lack of legality. So, and the cover-up, right? So, and the unbelievable reality that the origins were actually caused by some kind of completely irresponsible, negligent, incompetent collaboration between our government and foreign governments, and they basically appear to have created a pandemic, all as a result of the irresponsible biodefense enterprise. So our kids are going to get it, and they are going to fix it. My suggestion to current leaders is, why don't you make them proud and fix it yourselves, rather than making our kids have to fix it someday?
Right.
What a great way to summarize this and wrap this up. But we want to have a little bit of fun before we're done. So
okay. Well, first, before we get to the fun, though, we have the business closure. Well, can you share? We will put it in the notes too, but share with everybody where they can follow you if you want to direct them to you, and how to get a hold of your book as well.
Sure. My contact information is on unyielding.org on the contact tab. The tribute to my colleague, Russ Dingell, who the book is a tribute to, is at unyielding.org. The entire history of the anthrax vaccine experience and our efforts to get records corrected is on unyielding.org as well. If you click right on the book, right there at the top of unyielding.org, it'll take you to the publisher's website, Skyhorse Publishing. Very grateful for them being willing to put this work out. Very grateful for Children's Health Defense and RFK Jr. for being the imprint sponsor of the book. And if they click on the book, takes them to Skyhorse. At Skyhorse Publishing's website, it'll take them directly to the various vendor websites, Amazon. Barnes and Nobles, the various book vendors. You can just do a Google search for Unyielding and Rempfer, and it'll pop right up as well. And then finally, before we close out, I'll give that disclaimer that the Department of Defense says by law that I have to give, that even though I'm a military retired member, I have to make sure everybody's clear that my opinion does not reflect that of the Department of Defense or the United States government. And so with that, I'm very hopeful that my opinion and my suggestions and recommendations to our military leaderships ultimately does represent their opinion.
I love that. All right, now for fun, because Tim's always I have to calm him down because he's always about fun. If it's all right with you, because we like to end our interviews with a little fun segment, and we didn't prep you ahead of time. This was coming, but I'm sure you'll like it.
What you got?
We were going to ask, so if you could pilot any aircraft from history, which one? Okay, now I'm going to give you 4 to choose from. Which one would you choose and why? And here's the options: the Wright Brothers Flyer, Spitfire from World War II, SR-71 Blackbird. I don't know that one.
I'll
or
show you later.
The Space Shuttle. So Can you narrow it down to one out of those? and why would you pick that one?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to fly any one of those. Been a part of aviation history with all those trailblazers. But if I could be an astronaut and go up in the space shuttle, or have gone up in the space shuttle, or any future spacecraft, you can't not want to do that. So
Yeah, I totally agree.
Very good. Perfect answer. Awesome. Well,
maybe Elon Musk will reach out.
There you go.
Yeah, you never know.
There you go.
He sent those 4 civilians into space, so you never know.
Oh man. Thank you so much for joining us, sharing your insights, and being here. We will put the links up. We loved having you, and total honor to have you on the show.
Yeah, if you can, when we get.
Thank you so much for what you guys are doing, because it takes professionals with oaths and codes to turn things around, and you guys are doing that. You guys are doing the requisite debrief, and just as we did as operational practitioners in our military realm. So I think really important time for the medical profession and public health in general to try to restore trust. If they cover it up, the lack of trust will only get worse. And so I think that I think there's an incredible opportunity for them to hopefully fix some of these malfunctions, and the American people, the public in general, will be proud of them versus growing disappointment.
Thank you so much, Colonel Rempfer, for joining us today and sharing your incredible journey insights and your book, Unyielding, Marathons Against Illegal Mandates. It has been a true honor to have you on the show.
And for our listeners, if you found today's episode interesting, please make sure to subscribe, leave us a review, share this episode with your friends and family, and you can find Colonel Rempfer's book, Unyielding, Marathons Against Illegal Mandates, on Amazon for a deeper dive into his story and advocacy. And we do have a shout out for today. We have a shout out today to a fan, Donna Settlemeyer. Hi, Donna. We're shouting you out once again, and thank you so much for always keeping in touch via email or on our weekly DocTales. We appreciate your attention and engagement with us. See you around on the DocTales next time. And for all the rest of you, stay curious, stay informed, and stay BS free.
It's no secret that medicine is a bit, uptight. That's why Tim and I created BS Free MD, to mix things up a little and have fun in the process. Besides, we are having these exact same discussions all the time, so we thought we might as well invite everyone to the party. If you really like us, you can get plenty more, and maybe see one of Tim's cool tattoos on our Instagram or Facebook pages at BS Free MD. See you next time.
But we try to keep BS Free MD as raw and real as possible. We can't be held responsible for any medical decisions or discussions had as a result of what you've heard on the show. We know, bummer. But the truth is, we really do care about your questions. So feel free to reach out to us by email at doc@bsfreemd.com.